Tonight, we explore one of history's most unexpected stories. A tale that defies everything we think we know about war, about enemies, about what happens when soldiers cross the boundaries between nations. This is the story of how hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, captured during the Second World War and brought to America as prisoners, found themselves facing a choice that would have seemed impossible just years before. When the war ended and the time came for them to return home, many didn't want to leave. Some begged to stay. Others tried to escape, not to return to Germany, but to remain in America. And years later, thousands would make the journey back across the Atlantic, not as prisoners this time, but as immigrants seeking to reclaim what they had discovered behind barbed wire, a different way of life, a different understanding of the world, and perhaps most surprisingly, a sense of hope they had never known under the Nazi regime. This is not a simple story of good versus evil. It's something more nuanced, more human, and in many ways, more profound. It's about what happens when ideology meets reality, when propaganda crashes against lived experience, when men raised to hate discover unexpected kindness from their supposed enemies. It's about the 425,000 German prisoners of war who lived in 700 camps across the United States between 1943 and 1946, and how their time on American soil changed them in ways neither they nor their captors could have predicted. The story begins in the deserts of North Africa and on the battlefields of Europe, but it finds its heart in the farmlands of Texas, the forests of Wisconsin, the orchards of California, and the small towns scattered across 46 American states. It's a story that remained largely hidden for decades, an all but forgotten part of history, as the Associated Press would later describe it, despite the profound impact it had on both the prisoners who lived it and the Americans who witnessed it. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let's journey back to this remarkable chapter of World War II, when enemies became, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings who shared meals, worked side by side, and sometimes sang Christmas carols together around American pianos. The transformation we're about to explore didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis until the very end. Some Americans remained hostile to their German captors throughout the war. But for many, something unexpected occurred during those years. Seeds of doubt about Nazi ideology took root. Preconceptions about American life crumbled. And when the time came to return to a devastated Germany, to cities reduced to rubble, to a society torn apart by defeat and occupation, many of these prisoners realized that their time in captivity had shown them not just a different country, but a different way of being in the world. Tonight's journey will take us from the moment of capture through the astonishing voyage across the Atlantic, into the camps themselves with their daily rhythms and unexpected comforts, out into the fields and forests, where prisoners worked alongside American farmers, and finally to that bittersweet moment when the order came to return home. We'll explore how a nation at war treated its enemies with a degree of humanity that shocked the prisoners themselves. We'll discover how American abundance and democratic values, experienced firsthand, rather than filtered through propaganda, transformed the worldviews of young German men. And we'll understand why, when given the choice between returning to their homeland and somehow finding a way to stay in the country that had held them prisoner, thousands chose America. This is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a story about the power of humane treatment, about the unexpected consequences of following international law even in wartime, about how small acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. It's about farmers in Nebraska who invited prisoners to their dinner tables, about guards who shared cigarettes and photographs of their families, about American women who sent food packages to Germany after the war to help the men who had worked their fields. It's about the German prisoner who 40 years after escaping to avoid repatriation finally came forward to tell his story. It's about the 91-year-old former prisoner who returned to the camp where he'd been held just to say thank you to America. So settle in as we explore this forgotten chapter. Let the soft cadence of this narrative carry you through the story of how prisoners of war became, in many cases, ambassadors for democracy, how captivity became education, and how enemies became something else entirely. This is the story of how German POWs begged America to keep them after World War II. The Arrival, Journey to America. The story of German prisoners in America begins not on American soil, but in the brutal heat of the North African desert, and later in the forests and fields of Europe. In April of 1943, General Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. These were elite soldiers, panzer tank crews, and infantrymen who had fought with skill and discipline across the deserts of North Africa. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had been taught that they were the superior fighting force of a superior race. They had expected to die in battle, or at worst to be captured by the British. What they did not expect was what came next. More than 150,000 prisoners poured into Allied hands after that surrender. The British, already struggling with overcrowded prison facilities and severe food shortages, made an urgent request to the United States. Take these prisoners off our hands. America agreed, though reluctantly. The nation had never held large numbers of foreign prisoners before. The logistics were daunting. How do you transport tens of thousands of enemy soldiers across a submarine-infested Atlantic? Where do you house them? How do you guard them? What do you feed them? Nobody had the answers, but the prisoners kept coming. After the Afrika Korps came an average of 20,000 new prisoners each month. Following the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the numbers exploded to 30,000 per month. In the final months of the war, 60,000 German prisoners arrived on American shores every single month. The journey across the Atlantic was the prisoners' first encounter with a reality that didn't match the propaganda they had been fed. Many of these young men had been told that America was a cultural wasteland, a nation of mongrels and gangsters, barely civilized, and certainly inferior to the refined culture of Germany. They had been warned that if captured, they would face brutal treatment, perhaps even execution. What they discovered instead began the moment they set foot on the Liberty ships that would carry them to America. These vessels, designed to transport American troops and supplies to Europe, would have been empty on their return voyage. Instead, they carried prisoners, sometimes as many as 30,000 in a single month, arriving at ports in New York or Virginia. And from the very first moment, the prisoners noticed something unexpected. They were being fed substantial meals. Not the meager rations they had grown accustomed to in the German military. Certainly not the starvation diet they had feared as prisoners, but real, abundant food. There was meat, there were vegetables, there was bread and plenty of it. The Germans ate in a kind of stunned silence. Some thought it might be a trick, a final good meal before they met some terrible fate. Others simply couldn't believe that America, which they had been told was on the verge of collapse under the strain of war, could afford to feed enemy prisoners so generously. But the food kept coming, meal after meal, day after day, during the long voyage across the Atlantic. And with each meal, with each day that passed, without the brutality they had been warned to expect, something began to shift in the minds of these young German soldiers. The voyage itself was not without danger. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, and the Liberty ships carrying prisoners could not display any markings that might identify them as prisoner transports. There was always the risk that a German submarine might torpedo a ship carrying their own countrymen, an irony that was not lost on the prisoners. But most crossings were uneventful, if tense. The prisoners spent their days in the hold, playing cards, talking among themselves, speculating about what awaited them in America. The hardcore Nazis among them insisted that it would be brutal, that the Americans would use them as slave labor, that they should prepare to resist at every opportunity. But others, particularly those who had been captured later in the war and had witnessed Germany's declining fortunes, were less certain. Then came landfall. The first sight of America struck many prisoners with almost physical force. As the ships pulled into New York Harbor or the port of Hampton Roads in Virginia, the German prisoners crowded the rails to see this nation that had become their enemy. What they saw was almost impossible to process. There were no bomb craters, no ruined buildings, no signs of the devastating war that was tearing Europe apart. Instead, they saw intact cities, bustling ports, modern infrastructure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. The Statue of Liberty for those arriving in New York stood as a symbol that some found ironic, others oddly moving. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also witnessing a vision of prosperity and normalcy that stood in stark contrast to everything they had known in wartime Europe. The processing that followed their arrival was thorough, but not cruel. The prisoners underwent medical examinations, much like any military recruit. They were assigned serial numbers, photographed, fingerprinted. They filled out forms providing their medical history, their military background, details of their capture. All of this information was carefully recorded and filed, creating a permanent record that the War Department would maintain. It was methodical, bureaucratic, and surprisingly humane. The American guards were professional but not hostile. There were no beatings, no abuse, no deliberate humiliation. For prisoners who had been taught that Americans were barely civilized barbarians, this restraint was itself a revelation. Then came perhaps the most shocking part of the arrival process, the train journey to their assigned camps. The prisoners were loaded onto Pullman Railroad cars, the same comfortable passenger cars that ordinary Americans use for long-distance travel. These were not cattle cars, not bare boxcars, but genuine passenger trains with seats, windows, and a level of comfort that exceeded what most German soldiers had experienced, even during peacetime train travel in Germany. The prisoners settled into their seats, some still wary, others beginning to relax. And as the trains pulled out of the coastal cities and began the long journey across America, they pressed their faces to the windows and saw a country that shattered every preconception they had held. The size of America alone was staggering. These young Germans came from a relatively small country, and even those who had fought across North Africa and Europe had never imagined the sheer scale of the American continent. Hour after hour, the trains rolled through landscapes that seemed to go on forever. Vast farmlands stretched to the horizon, mile after mile of crops that spoke of agricultural abundance beyond anything Germany had known. Towns and cities appeared, and disappeared, each one apparently untouched by war, each one lit up at night in a way that would have been impossible in wartime Europe, where blackouts were the rule. Factories stood intact, their smokestacks reaching toward the sky, producing the endless stream of material that was fueling the Allied war effort. The prisoners talked among themselves in hushed voices. Some still insisted this must be an elaborate deception, that surely the real America must be hidden somewhere behind this facade of prosperity. But as the miles rolled by, as the train passed through state after state, it became harder and harder to maintain that belief. This wasn't a carefully staged display for the benefit of prisoners. This was simply America, vast and wealthy and untouched by the destruction that had ravaged Europe. And for many of the prisoners, this first glimpse of American reality planted seeds of doubt about everything else they had been told. The trains carried prisoners to camps scattered across 46 states. The locations had been carefully chosen based on several criteria established by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, the agency responsible for overseeing the prisoner of war program. The camps needed to be away from urban, industrial areas for security purposes. They needed to be in regions with mild climates to minimize construction costs. And ideally, they should be located where the prisoners could help alleviate the severe labor shortage that America was experiencing as millions of its young men shipped overseas to fight. Most camps ended up in the South and Southwest, in states like Texas, which would eventually house 90,000 enemy prisoners in camps spread across the state, more than any other state in the Union. But prisoners also found themselves in camps scattered across the Midwest, in Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota, in the mountain states like Colorado and Oklahoma, in the forests of Wisconsin and Michigan, in California's agricultural valleys, even in small camps in the Northeast. By the time the program reached its peak in 1945, there were 511 main and branch camps operating across the country, housing 425,000 German prisoners, along with smaller numbers of Italian and Japanese prisoners. As the prisoners arrived at their assigned camps, they encountered yet another surprise. The camps themselves, while clearly prisons with their guard towers and barbed wire fences, were not the concentration camps or brutal prisoner stockades they had feared. The barracks were simple but adequate, similar to what American soldiers lived in on bases across the country. There were mess halls that served 3 substantial meals a day. There were recreational areas, libraries, even canteens where prisoners could purchase snacks, cigarettes, toiletries, and other small luxuries with the wages they would earn from their work. The architecture and layout deliberately mirrored German camps to comply with international agreements and to ensure reciprocal treatment of American prisoners in German hands. The prisoners settled into their new homes with a mixture of relief and confusion. They were still prisoners, still behind barbed wire, still under guard. But this was nothing like what they had expected. And as they began to learn the routines of camp life, as they started to interact with their American guards and with the local communities near their camps, as they began to work in American fields and factories, they would discover that their journey was just beginning. The physical journey from North Africa or Europe to America was complete. But the journey that would transform many of them from committed Nazis into convinced Democrats, as one former prisoner would later describe it, was only starting. The arrival of these hundreds of thousands of German prisoners on American soil created a situation that was unprecedented in American history. Nobody quite knew how it would all work out. There were fears among American civilians, concerns in Washington, debates about security and cost, and the proper way to treat enemy soldiers. But what nobody could have predicted was that this mass movement of prisoners would become, in effect, an enormous, unintentional experiment in the power of humane treatment and democratic values. An experiment that would have profound consequences, not just for the prisoners themselves, but for post-war Germany, and for the broader understanding of how former enemies might be reconciled. First impressions: a different world. The disorientation that German prisoners felt upon arriving in America only intensified as they began to truly observe the world around them. Every detail of American life seemed to contradict what they had been taught. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had painted a picture of America as a nation in decline, torn apart by racial conflict, economically devastated, culturally bankrupt. The reality they encountered was so dramatically different that many prisoners initially couldn't process what they were seeing. Consider the simple fact of electricity. In the barracks where the prisoners slept, electric lights illuminated every room. This was not unusual or special, it was simply standard. But for young men from Germany, particularly those from rural areas or working class backgrounds, the abundance of electric power was remarkable. Many had grown up in what one former prisoner described as cold water flats, apartments or homes without reliable electricity, certainly without the kind of universal, taken for granted electrical service that seemed to exist everywhere in America. In the camps, lights came on with the flip of a switch. They stayed on reliably. Nobody rationed electricity. Nobody worried about power shortages. It was simply there, abundant and constant. This observation extended beyond the camps themselves. As prisoners were taken out to work, on farms or in small towns, they noticed that every farmhouse, no matter how modest, had electricity in every room. Every home had electric lights, electric appliances, electric conveniences that would have been luxuries in Germany. Refrigerators stood in American kitchens, keeping food fresh in a way that most Germans could only dream about. Electric stoves, electric irons, electric fans in summer, electric heaters in winter. The casual, everyday use of electrical power spoke to a level of prosperity that contradicted everything the prisoners had been told about American poverty and decline. The telephones were another revelation. It seemed like every American home had a telephone. Rural farm families could pick up a phone and call neighbors miles away, could order supplies from town, could check on the weather or the markets, or simply chat with friends. This kind of communication infrastructure existed in German cities, perhaps, but certainly not in the countryside, and certainly not to this universal extent. The prisoners noticed American guards casually making phone calls, farmers calling in orders, townspeople connected by this invisible network of communication that just worked reliably and universally. But it was the food that perhaps made the deepest impression. The abundance of food in America during wartime was almost incomprehensible to young men who had experienced increasing scarcity in Germany even before their military service, and who had eaten increasingly meagre rations as the war progressed. In the camps, prisoners received the same rations as American troops. This was mandated by the Geneva Convention, which required equal treatment in terms of food and basic necessities. What the prisoners didn't know was that American military rations were themselves abundant by German standards. 3 times a day, prisoners sat down to meals that included meat and vegetables, bread and dairy products, quantities of food that exceeded what most had eaten even in peacetime Germany. There was beef and pork, chicken and fish. There were fresh vegetables when in season, canned vegetables when not. There was milk, cheese, butter. There was bread, always bread, good bread in quantities that seemed unlimited. And there were treats, desserts, coffee, sometimes even ice cream. The canteens in the camps sold snacks and sodas, candy bars and cigarettes. Prisoners who worked earned wages 80 cents a day, which they could spend on these luxuries. One former prisoner, Gunther Grau, who was held at Camp Lewis in Washington state, later wrote about standing in front of the camp store trying to decide what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, he remembered. This simple choice, this casual decision between two small luxuries, represented a level of abundance that was almost surreal to a young German soldier. And Graue was far from alone in this reaction. Across hundreds of camps, German prisoners made similar discoveries about American abundance. The quality and variety of food available even to prisoners struck many as proof that the propaganda about American poverty had been completely false. These were enemy soldiers, captured combatants who by rights should have received only the minimum necessary to keep them alive and healthy. Instead, they ate better than they had in the German army, better than their families were eating back in Germany, better in many cases than they had ever eaten in their lives. When some prisoners complained about being POWs, citing the lack of girlfriends and contact with family, other prisoners would remind them, "But the food is excellent. The clothing is adequate. We're treated well." The treatment by guards reinforced this sense of a different kind of society. American guards were professional and maintained discipline, but they were not brutal. There were no random beatings, no deliberate cruelty, no efforts to humiliate or degrade the prisoners. Guards and prisoners could talk within the constraints of the language barrier that existed until prisoners began learning English. Guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. They showed photographs of their families, talked about missing home, revealed themselves as human beings with the same hopes and fears as anyone else. This humanization of the enemy worked both ways. The prisoners, too, revealed themselves as individual human beings rather than faceless representatives of the Nazi threat. Young men who talked about their families back in Germany, who wondered if their homes were still standing, who worried about mothers and sisters and sweethearts. Men who were good at football, or skilled woodcarvers, or talented musicians, or simply good workers who did their jobs well. The relationship between guards and prisoners varied enormously from camp to camp and person to person, but in many places, a kind of rough mutual respect developed, based not on friendship exactly, but on shared human recognition. As prisoners were taken out of the camps to work on farms and in forests, they encountered an America that was even more startling than what they had seen from the train windows. The farmers who contracted for prisoner labor treated them not as subhuman enemies, but as workers. The farmers paid the government for this labor 40 to 45 cents per hour per prisoner, which helped offset the enormous cost of the POW program. The prisoners themselves received 10 cents per hour, or 80 cents for a typical workday, which accumulated in accounts they could access through the camp canteen. But beyond the wages, what struck many prisoners was the attitude of the farmers themselves. Many of these farmers were themselves of German descent, bearing names like Hoffmann, Schultz, and Möller, speaking German, or at least understanding it from their grandparents. These German Americans had no particular love for the Nazi regime, but they felt a certain kinship with young German prisoners who spoke their ancestral language. They invited prisoners to eat meals with them. They brought them cold beer on hot summer days. They sometimes bent or ignored the regulations about fraternization, taking prisoners to town, to movie theaters, even to local taverns. The prisoners worked in the fields and noticed things. They noticed that every American farm, no matter how modest, had tractors. Mechanized farming equipment that was far from universal in Germany stood here as standard agricultural infrastructure. They noticed the size of the farms, the abundance of the harvests, the casual acceptance of prosperity that would have been remarkable in Europe. They picked cotton and harvested wheat, collected fruit from orchards and cut timber from forests, worked in sugar beet fields and helped bring in the potato harvest. And everywhere they worked, they saw evidence of a nation whose productive capacity seemed almost limitless. The contrast with Germany grew sharper in their minds as letters from home began to arrive. These letters, censored but not prohibited, brought news of increasing hardship back in the Reich. Food shortages were becoming severe. Allied bombing was devastating German cities. The military situation was deteriorating. Family members wrote carefully, knowing that censors would read every word. But the subtext was clear. Things were getting worse at home, much worse. Meanwhile, the prisoners in America were eating 3 substantial meals a day, sleeping in warm barracks, receiving medical care when needed, playing football on camp fields, attending movies and concerts, studying English and other subjects in camp educational programs. Some prisoners struggled with this cognitive dissonance. They were Nazis, or at least they had been raised as Nazis, indoctrinated from childhood in the superiority of German culture and the inferiority of everything non-German. How could they reconcile this ideology with the evidence of their own eyes? Some couldn't, or wouldn't. They remained committed to Nazi ideology despite everything they saw. They intimidated other prisoners, held secret kangaroo courts for those suspected of becoming too friendly with Americans, sometimes even murdered fellow prisoners who they deemed traitors. These hardcore Nazis, often members of the Afrika Korps captured early in the war when Germany still seemed destined for victory, represented a serious problem that American authorities struggled to address. But others, particularly those captured later in the war, those who had witnessed Germany's declining fortunes firsthand, began to question what they had been taught. The questioning started small. A doubt here, a recognition there. Maybe America wasn't the cultural wasteland they had been told about. Maybe democracy wasn't as weak and chaotic as Nazi propaganda claimed. Maybe the abundance they were seeing wasn't an illusion or a temporary thing, but reflected something fundamental about how American society was organized. The access to uncensored information accelerated this questioning. Every camp received American newspapers. Prisoners could read, if they knew enough English, or could find someone to translate, about what was actually happening in the war. They could see maps showing the steady Allied advance. They could read casualty reports and production figures. They couldn't wave all this away as enemy propaganda because they could verify at least some of it through their own observations. The industrial might of America, which the papers reported, was evident in the equipment they saw, the abundance they experienced, the casual prosperity that surrounded them. Some camps received special attention in terms of information and education. The camp libraries stocked books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, works by anti-Nazi exile writers like Erich Maria Remarque, Thomas Mann, Franz Werfel. Prisoners who had been curious about these forbidden books could now read them freely. One prisoner, writing in the intercamp journal Der Ruf, commented that if they had only had the opportunity to read these books before, their introduction to life, to war, and to politics would have been different. This access to banned literature represented a kind of re-education, though one that worked through exposure and availability rather than through force or overt propaganda. The cumulative effect of all these small observations, these daily contradictions between ideology and reality, was profound. Not every prisoner was affected. Not every prisoner changed his views, but many did, gradually, almost unconsciously at first. They noticed how American guards treated them. They experienced American abundance. They worked alongside American farmers who showed them basic human kindness. They read uncensored newspapers and banned books. They talked among themselves late at night in the barracks, comparing notes, questioning assumptions, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. And underlying all of it was a simple, powerful fact. They were treated as human beings, not as monsters, not as subhuman enemies, but as men who had been soldiers and were now prisoners. The Geneva Convention required this treatment, certainly, but America went beyond the minimum requirements in many ways. The quality of food exceeded the bare minimum. The recreational and educational opportunities went beyond what was strictly necessary. The relative freedom that prisoners experienced when working outside the camps suggested a level of trust that was remarkable, given that these were enemy soldiers. This humane treatment had a strategic purpose. American authorities hoped that by treating German prisoners well, Germany would reciprocate and treat American prisoners equally well. There were 90,000 American soldiers in German prisoner of war camps, and their safety was a constant concern. Every decision about how to treat German prisoners in America was made with an eye toward how it might affect American prisoners in Germany. The policy worked to an extent. While American prisoners in German camps certainly faced hardships, particularly as Germany's resources dwindled, they generally received treatment that adhered to Geneva Convention standards. But beyond this strategic calculation, the humane treatment also reflected something about American values. The nation that had committed itself to fighting fascism, that had declared its opposition to Nazi brutality and totalitarian oppression, felt compelled to demonstrate that democratic societies could maintain their principles even toward enemies. This wasn't just propaganda or calculation. It was a genuine belief that how you treat even your enemies says something fundamental about who you are as a society. For the German prisoners, this belief manifested in 1,000 small ways. In the guard who shared his cigarettes, in the farmer who invited them to dinner, in the library filled with books, in the relative abundance and normalcy of life, even behind barbed wire. And slowly, for many prisoners, these small manifestations of democratic values began to work a subtle transformation, preparing them for the more formal re-education efforts that would come later, but also simply opening them to the possibility that they had been wrong about America, wrong about democracy, and perhaps wrong about the system they had been raised to serve. Camp life, beyond the barbed wire. The daily rhythm of life in a German prisoner of war camp in America followed patterns that were both regimented and surprisingly comfortable. The camps themselves varied enormously in size and character, from massive facilities housing thousands of prisoners to small branch camps of just 30 or 40 men, temporarily established near farms or factories that needed labor. But they all shared certain common features, certain routines that structured the prisoners' days and shaped their experience of captivity. A typical day began early, as it does in any military setting. The German prisoners, under the direction of their own non-commissioned officers, woke themselves, made their beds, and prepared for roll call. This self-governance was one of the distinctive features of the POW program. American authorities, recognizing that they lacked sufficient German-speaking guards to manage every detail of camp life, allowed the prisoners to maintain their own internal military discipline. German NCOs directed their men, marched them to and from meals, prepared them for work details, and handled much of the day-to-day administration of camp life. This system had significant advantages. It recreated the familiar feeling of military routine for the prisoners, which helped maintain order and gave structure to their days. It also dramatically reduced the number of American guards needed. Instead of one guard for every 10 prisoners, which had been the initial estimate, the self-governance system meant that only one guard was needed for every 30 prisoners. This efficiency was not just a cost-saving measure. It reflected the surprising docility of most German prisoners. Despite being enemy soldiers, despite Nazi ideology that emphasized resistance and never surrendering, the actual behavior of most prisoners in American camps was cooperative and peaceful. The escape statistics tell this story clearly. Out of 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States during the war, only 2,222, less than 1%, ever attempted to escape. This rate was about half the escape rate for Italian prisoners, and significantly lower than the escape rate in American civilian prisons during the same period. Most attempted escapes were quickly thwarted, with escapees captured within hours or days. The most elaborate escape attempt, from Camp Papago Park in Arizona in December 1944, saw 25 prisoners tunnel their way out of the camp and attempt to reach the Colorado River. Their plan was to float down the river by raft all the way to Mexico and then find passage back to Germany. The plan failed when they discovered that the river they had studied on maps was actually a dry riverbed for much of the year. The reasons prisoners gave for escape attempts were telling. Very few claimed they were trying to rejoin the German war effort, which would have been virtually impossible from inside the United States anyway. Instead, most cited boredom, a desire to experience freedom for a while, or simple curiosity about whether they could do it. Some wanted to reach Argentina or Mexico, places they imagined might be sympathetic to Germans. But the overall escape rate suggested that most prisoners recognized that they had it relatively good where they were, and that attempting to escape would likely only make their situation worse. After roll call and breakfast, the day's activities depended on whether prisoners had work assignments. Those who did would be loaded onto trucks or buses and transported to their work sites, whether farms, forests, factories, or other locations where their labour was needed. We'll explore this work in more detail later, but it's worth noting here that work was seen as a privilege rather than a punishment. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of POW labour as long as it didn't directly support the enemy war effort, and as long as the prisoners were paid. Working meant earning money, which meant being able to buy extras at the camp canteen. It meant getting outside the camp, seeing something other than barracks and guard towers. It meant the time passed more quickly. Prisoners who weren't working, whether because they were officers who couldn't be compelled to work under the Geneva Convention, because they were sick or injured, or simply because there wasn't enough work to go around, spent their days in the camp. And this is where the remarkable recreational and educational opportunities of camp life become apparent. The camps were not idle warehouses for enemy soldiers. They were, in many ways, small cities with their own internal cultures and activities. Almost every camp had a library, stocked with books donated by the YMCA, purchased by the camp administration, or even bought by prisoners themselves with their wages. The YMCA printed thousands of copies of books specifically for POW camps and even provided bookbinding materials so camps could repair well-worn volumes. The demand for reading material always exceeded supply, with the average being only half a book per prisoner, but the libraries were treasured resources. Prisoners could read German literature, American books translated into German, technical manuals, magazines, and newspapers. The newspapers were particularly significant. Every camp published its own newspaper, filled with poetry and short stories written by prisoners, puzzles and games, listings of upcoming events, even classified ads. These papers served as community bulletins, literary journals, and ways for prisoners to maintain some connection to their intellectual and creative lives. But the camps also received American newspapers, which provided prisoners with access to news about the war and the world. This access to relatively uncensored information stood in stark contrast to what prisoners would have received in Germany, where all news was filtered through the Nazi propaganda machine. Educational opportunities abounded in most camps. Prisoners could take classes in English, which was extremely popular as it was obviously useful for interacting with guards and American civilians, and also as a skill that might be valuable after the war. But the curriculum went far beyond English language instruction. Camps offered courses in mathematics, chemistry, physics, history, art, literature, carpentry, commerce, veterinary medicine, even stenography and shorthand. The courses were taught by prisoner experts who had been teachers, professors, or skilled professionals in civilian life. And they followed a traditional German educational model with examinations, grades, and graduation certificates. The quality of this education was taken seriously. At Fort Russell in Texas, for example, prisoners could choose from 12 different courses, and by January 1945, 314 POWs had enrolled. The War Department even arranged for extension courses through local American universities for prisoners who wanted to study subjects not available within their camp. These university courses benefited both the prisoners, who received valuable education, and cash-strapped American colleges, which received tuition payments. When prisoners finally returned to Germany, many carried mimeographed graduation certificates from places like the University of Hausi or the University of Walters, named after their camps. These certificates, because they were taught by German experts using German educational standards, were accepted for full credit by German universities. The recreational activities available in the camps were equally impressive. Football, what Americans call soccer, was extremely popular. Most camps had football fields, and prisoners organised teams, leagues, tournaments. The games were taken seriously, with passionate fan support and fierce but generally good-natured competition. Other sports were available too: volleyball, boxing, track and field, even swimming in camps located near bodies of water. These athletic activities served multiple purposes. They provided exercise and entertainment. They helped maintain morale. They gave prisoners a sense of normalcy and routine. And they created a competitive outlet that channeled energy in productive rather than destructive directions. The camps also supported cultural and artistic activities. Theatrical productions were common, with prisoners writing, directing, and performing plays. Some camps had orchestras or bands with instruments provided by the YMCA or purchased by the camps themselves. Prisoners gave concerts, both of classical music and popular songs. Art classes allowed prisoners to paint and draw, and some prisoners created remarkable works of art during their captivity. Wood carving was particularly popular, with skilled prisoners creating intricate toys, dishes, utensils, and decorative objects that they sometimes gave to American guards or local families as gifts. Religious services were provided, with chaplains assigned to minister to prisoners' spiritual needs. The prisoners included men of various religious backgrounds, though most were at least nominally Christian, either Catholic or Lutheran. Church services provided not just spiritual comfort, but also a sense of community and continuity with their lives before the war. Some prisoners found genuine solace in faith during their time in captivity, while others simply appreciated the ritual and routine of religious observance. The canteen was a central feature of camp life. Here, prisoners could spend their wages on items that made captivity more bearable. The selection varied by camp and availability, but typically included snacks, candy, cigarettes, tobacco, soft drinks, toiletries, writing materials, playing cards, and various small luxury items. Prisoners who worked regularly could accumulate significant funds in their accounts, hundreds of dollars by the end of the war, which represented real purchasing power. The ability to buy these small extras made a significant difference in the quality of camp life. The social dynamics within the camps were complex and sometimes troubling. Not all prisoners were cooperative. Not all prisoners abandoned Nazi ideology. The camps contained men who remained committed Nazis, and these men often dominated camp life through intimidation and violence. The infamous Holy Ghost murders, where prisoners suspected of being anti-Nazi or too friendly with Americans were killed by fellow prisoners, reflected the power that hardcore Nazis wielded even in captivity. The American military executed 14 Germans after the war for murdering fellow prisoners, and 8 others served prison time for additional murders. The actual number of such killings was probably higher, as many apparent suicides were likely murders. American authorities struggled with this problem. They tried to identify and separate committed Nazis from other prisoners, creating special camps like the one in Alva, Oklahoma, specifically for Nazi loyalists. The screening process was imperfect, and determined Nazis often found ways to maintain their influence, even when supposedly segregated. The German prisoners themselves maintained their own internal hierarchy and discipline, which meant that Wehrmacht military structure and Nazi political organization often functioned behind the wire, even in American camps. But for many prisoners, particularly those captured later in the war, the internal Nazi pressure became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of the evidence around them. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, as news from home became more desperate, as the contrast between camp life in America and reality in Germany became more stark, the ideology that sustained hardcore Nazis began to ring hollow to more and more prisoners. The men captured after the Normandy invasion, who had witnessed firsthand Germany's crumbling defenses, were particularly skeptical of the true believers who still expected German victory. The camp administration played an important role in shaping this evolution, through careful provision of information, through educational opportunities, through humane treatment that demonstrated democratic values in action. The Americans created an environment where prisoners could, if they chose, begin to question their Nazi indoctrination. This wasn't overt propaganda or forced re-education, not at first. It was simply exposure to a different way of life, a different system of values, a different understanding of how society could be organized. The physical conditions of the camps reinforced this message. The barracks were simple but adequate, roughly comparable to housing for American soldiers on military bases. Each compound typically contained 20 barracks, each capable of housing 50 men. There were 4 kitchens with accompanying mess halls, 4 washrooms, and laundry facilities, 4 officer rooms. The camps had hospitals for medical care, fire stations, administration buildings, warehouses. Outside the prisoner compound stood quarters for American enlisted men and officers, sometimes even an officers' club and a theatre. The overall impression was one of organisation, efficiency, and adequacy, rather than luxury. But it was a far cry from concentration camps or the brutal prisoner facilities that Nazi propaganda had warned about. The quality of medical care particularly impressed many prisoners. When they got sick or injured, they received treatment from qualified doctors and nurses. The medical facilities, while basic, had necessary supplies and equipment. Prisoners with serious conditions could be transferred to better equipped hospitals. This attention to prisoners' health and well-being reflected both Geneva Convention requirements and American values about the proper treatment of human beings, even enemy human beings. The camp experience, then, was not simply about confinement. It was about exposure to a different way of life. Prisoners saw that a democratic society could be orderly and organised without being totalitarian. They saw that prosperity didn't require aggressive expansion or racial supremacy. They saw that human beings could be treated with dignity even in wartime, even when those human beings were enemies. They saw that the rule of law, international agreements like the Geneva Convention, actually meant something and could constrain the behaviour of nations and their militaries. Not every prisoner absorbed these lessons. Not every prisoner was receptive to these messages. The hardcore Nazis remained committed to their ideology despite everything they experienced. But for many prisoners, the cumulative effect of camp life in America was a gradual erosion of certainty about the Nazi worldview. The propaganda they had been fed didn't match the reality they were living. And as we'll see, this disconnect would only become more pronounced as prisoners left the camps to work in American communities, where they would encounter not just American prosperity and organisation, but American people in all their human complexity. Working the American land. When the German prisoners arrived in America in 1943 and 1944, the United States faced a crisis that seemed almost impossible to resolve. Millions of American men had joined the armed forces and shipped overseas to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The farms and factories they had worked in now desperately needed labourers. Agricultural production was critical to the war effort, both to feed American troops and to supply the Allies. Industrial production needed to be maintained at unprecedented levels to manufacture the weapons, vehicles, and supplies necessary for fighting a two-front war. But who would do the work? The answer, paradoxically, turned out to be the enemy soldiers captured on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of prisoner labour under specific conditions. The work could not directly support the war effort, so prisoners could not be assigned to manufacture weapons or ammunition. The work could not be dangerous or degrading. Prisoners had to be paid for their labour. Officers could not be compelled to work, though enlisted men and non-commissioned officers could be. Within these constraints, American authorities recognised that German prisoners represented a vast pool of potential workers who could help address the critical labour shortage. The programme that developed was enormous in scale and remarkably successful. Prisoners worked in agriculture above all else, harvesting crops that might otherwise have rotted in the fields for lack of hands to pick them. They picked cotton in Texas and Arizona, harvested wheat across the Great Plains, collected oranges and other fruits from California orchards, cut timber in the forests of Wisconsin and Michigan, dug potatoes in Maine and Minnesota, worked in sugar beet fields across the Midwest. The agricultural work was hard, back-breaking labour in many cases, but it kept food production flowing during a critical period. The mechanics of the work programme were carefully organised. Farmers or businesses that needed labour would submit a contract to the military authorities overseeing the POW programme. The contract specified how many workers were needed, what work they would be doing, where they would be housed, what conditions would be provided. The Geneva Convention required that prisoner labour not be dangerous and not directly related to the war effort. The prisoners had to receive 1 day of rest per week. They had to be paid. If the contractor's proposal met these requirements, it would be approved, and prisoners would be assigned to the work. The farmers paid the government 40 to 45 cents per hour per prisoner, which was the prevailing wage for agricultural labour at the time. This payment helped offset the enormous cost of running the POW programme, which included not just guarding prisoners, but also feeding, housing, and providing medical care for them. In 1944 alone, these payments totaled $22 million, and it was estimated that the use of prisoner labour saved the government $80 million by employing them in military installations and other government projects rather than leaving them idle in camps. The prisoners themselves received a portion of these wages, typically 10 cents per hour or 80 cents for a typical workday. This was roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private, the minimum pay for enlisted soldiers. The money accumulated in accounts set up in the prisoners' names, accessible through the camp canteen for purchasing extras, and then paid out in full when they were repatriated. By the end of the war, many prisoners had accumulated several $100s in these accounts, a substantial sum that would help them when they returned to Germany. But beyond the wages and the economic benefits, the work program had profound effects on the prisoners and on the Americans they worked alongside. The prisoners left their camps each workday, traveling by truck or bus to farms and work sites scattered across rural America. They spent long hours working in fields, cutting trees in forests, processing crops in canneries and mills. This work brought them into direct contact with American civilians, particularly farmers, in a way that camp life never could. Many of the farmers who employed prisoner labour were themselves of German descent. Names like Hoffmann, Schultz, Müller, Schmidt dotted the rural Midwest and other regions where German immigration had been heavy in the previous century. These German-American farmers often spoke at least some German, understood German culture, and felt a certain kinship with the young German prisoners, despite being deeply opposed to the Nazi regime. They distinguished between Hitler and the German people, between the Nazi government and the individual German soldiers who had been conscripted to fight. This distinction made all the difference in how the prisoners were treated. The farmers saw them as workers, as young men doing a job, not as subhuman enemies deserving only the minimum necessary treatment. They provided meals for the prisoners, often inviting them to eat at the family table. They brought cold beer to the fields on hot summer days. They talked with them, learned about their lives, shared stories about their own families. They sometimes bent or broke the regulations about fraternization, taking prisoners into town for a movie, stopping at a tavern for a drink, giving them small gifts or treats. In Moorhead, Minnesota, farmer Henry Peterson became particularly well liked by the German prisoners who worked his vegetable farms. He bent camp rules repeatedly, buying prisoners beer, taking them into town, treating them with a casual friendliness that went well beyond what regulations permitted. The prisoners responded to this kindness. They worked hard. They expressed gratitude. When the war ended and they were repatriated to Germany, several wrote to Peterson and other Moorhead residents requesting help in becoming American citizens. Many expressed profound gratitude for the treatment they had received. These relationships were replicated across thousands of farms and work sites. In South Carolina, a farmer named Cecil Camlin hired German prisoners to work his family farm. They built barns, repaired fences, did all the heavy labor of running a working farm. As the weeks passed, the Camlin family grew close to these German soldiers. When Christmas came, Cecil's mother cooked a feast and invited the Germans to share it. By the end of the night, the enemy soldiers were gathered around the piano, singing Christmas carols, while the Camlin family listened and sang along. It was an impossible scene, enemy soldiers and an American family celebrating Christmas together in the middle of a world war, but it happened, and it happened in countless variations across America. The work itself gave prisoners new perspectives on American life. They saw American prosperity up close and personal. Every farmhouse they entered had electricity, running water, a telephone. The farmers owned tractors and other mechanized equipment that was far from universal in Germany. The barns were full. The harvests were abundant. The land itself seemed richer, more productive, more generous than the fields they had known in Europe. And beyond the physical abundance, they saw how American families lived. The democratic chaos of American family life, where wives spoke their minds and children had opinions and decisions were made through discussion rather than decree, stood in stark contrast to the authoritarian household structure promoted by Nazi ideology. The prisoners also observed how American democracy functioned at the local level. The farmers they worked for were independent operators who made their own decisions about what to plant, when to harvest, where to sell their crops. Local government was minimal and largely responsive to the people it served. Schools educated children with a curriculum that emphasized individual development rather than state indoctrination. Churches operated freely without government interference. Small-town newspapers printed local news, and sometimes editorials critical of government policy. None of this was perfect, certainly. American democracy had deep flaws, particularly around race. But to young German men raised under totalitarian rule, even imperfect democracy represented a revelation. The racial dynamics of American society troubled many German prisoners, though perhaps not in the way we might expect. The prisoners encountered Jim Crow segregation in the South and elsewhere, and they saw Black American soldiers treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The irony was stark and inescapable. German prisoners of war could enter restaurants and businesses that Black American soldiers who guarded them could not. This contradiction between America's professed democratic values and the reality of racial segregation was not lost on the prisoners. Some were simply confused by it. Others felt a kind of solidarity with Black Americans who were also treated as outsiders in American society. The work program had its problems and its critics. American labor unions opposed it, arguing that prisoner labor took jobs from American workers and depressed wages. Some Americans thought the prisoners were being coddled, treated too well for enemy soldiers who had fought against the United States. There were concerns about security, though these proved largely unfounded given the very low escape rate. Some prisoners resisted working, citing their rights under the Geneva Convention or simply refusing to cooperate. These troublemakers were imprisoned within the camps on reduced rations until they agreed to work. But overall, the work program succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Agricultural production remained strong despite the loss of millions of American farm workers to the military. Essential industries kept operating, infrastructure projects continued, and perhaps most importantly, from a strategic perspective, the prisoners gained intimate exposure to American life that transformed many of them in ways that no amount of propaganda could have achieved. They saw American abundance not as a theoretical concept, but as a daily reality. They experienced American generosity not as propaganda, but as personal kindness from individual farmers. They observed American democracy not through Nazi propaganda that described it as weak and chaotic, but through their own eyes, watching how decisions were made, how communities functioned, how people lived in a free society. They learned English, which would prove valuable after the war. They developed work skills that would help them in post-war Germany. Some even learned new trades: carpentry, machine operation, agricultural techniques that were more advanced than what they had known. The farmers and other employers who worked with German prisoners often expressed surprise at how hard-working and skilled many of them were. While language barriers and sometimes reluctance to work could create problems, in general, the prisoners proved to be reliable workers who produced quality results. They were available immediately when needed and could be hired in exact numbers required. While they often worked more slowly than civilian workers, partly due to language difficulties and partly due to deliberate slowdowns by Nazi sympathizers who didn't want to help the American war effort, their work was generally more reliable and of higher quality than available alternatives. This reliability and quality helped change American attitudes toward the prisoners. It's one thing to hate an abstract enemy represented by Nazi propaganda and battlefield reports. It's quite another to spend day after day working alongside specific German soldiers who turn out to be ordinary young men doing their jobs, men who miss their families, who laugh at jokes, who appreciate kindness, who respond to fair treatment. The humanization worked both ways. Americans saw that German soldiers were people, not monsters, and German soldiers saw that Americans were people, not the cultural inferiors and gangsters of Nazi propaganda. The legacy of this work extends beyond the immediate wartime period. Many prisoners formed relationships with American farmers and families that continued long after the war. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years afterward. Some farmers sent care packages to Germany to help former prisoners struggling in the post-war devastation. Some prisoners, once Germany recovered enough to allow travel, returned to America to visit the families and farms where they had worked. And thousands of prisoners eventually emigrated to America, often with the help and sponsorship of the very farmers who had employed them as prisoners of war. The work program then was not just about addressing wartime labor shortages. It became an engine of transformation, exposing German prisoners to American values and American life in the most direct way possible. It demonstrated that democratic capitalism could produce abundance and opportunity. It showed that free societies could be orderly and productive without being authoritarian. And it revealed, through countless small acts of human kindness between farmers and prisoners, that enemies could become, if not quite friends, then at least fellow human beings deserving of respect and decent treatment. Building bridges, relationships with Americans. The official policy of the United States military toward German prisoners of war in America was clear and unambiguous. No fraternization. American guards and civilians were not to socialize with the prisoners beyond what was absolutely necessary for camp administration and work supervision. The policy had solid reasoning behind it. Fraternization might lead to security breaches. It might result in prisoners gathering intelligence or manipulating sympathetic Americans. It might be seen as going soft on the enemy at a time when American soldiers were dying on battlefields in Europe. And there was significant public pressure to maintain a hard line toward German prisoners, with many Americans writing letters to the government demanding harsher treatment or even execution of the POWs. But policy is one thing, reality is another. And the reality was that when you put German prisoners and American civilians in close proximity for months or years, when you have them working side by side in fields and factories, when guards spend every day with the same prisoners and farmers eat lunch with them and small-town merchants serve them, human relationships inevitably develop. The fraternization policy was widely ignored or bent beyond recognition, and these unauthorized relationships became one of the most significant aspects of the entire POW experience. Consider the guards first. These were American soldiers, often men who for various reasons, medical issues, age, or specific skills, had been assigned to guard duty rather than being sent to fight overseas. They understood that they were more fortunate than their peers who were dodging bullets in France or island hopping in the Pacific. Many felt somewhat guilty about their relatively safe assignment, and they spent their days and nights with German prisoners, watching them, escorting them to work, supervising their activities, existing in a kind of strange intimacy that military hierarchy and enemy status complicated but could not entirely prevent. The guards saw that the prisoners were young men much like themselves. They saw prisoners who worried about their families back in Germany, who missed their homes, who wanted the war to be over. They saw prisoners who were skilled woodcarvers or good football players or talented musicians. They saw men who responded to kindness, who appreciated fair treatment, who were trying to make the best of an uncertain situation. And gradually, despite regulations and official policy, many guards developed a kind of rough camaraderie with at least some of their charges. Cigarettes became a universal currency of relationship. Guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. Prisoners gave carved objects or other small gifts to guards. Guards showed photographs of their families to prisoners. They talked, within the limits of language barriers, about where they were from, what they did before the war, what they hoped to do after. These were not deep friendships in most cases. The power imbalance and the context of captivity prevented that. But they were human connections, moments of recognition that the young German on the other side of the fence or across the truck bed was in the end just another human being trying to survive a catastrophic war. The relationships that developed between prisoners and the American civilians they worked alongside were often more substantial. Farmers who employed prisoner labor spent long days with them during planting and harvest seasons. They ate meals together. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the fields. They shared the satisfaction of bringing in a good harvest and the frustration when weather or pests damaged crops. The farmers paid the government for this labor, yes, but they also recognized their obligation to treat these workers, prisoners or not, with basic human decency. The hospitality that some American families extended to German prisoners went well beyond duty or policy. In Minnesota, in South Carolina, in Texas and Nebraska and Wisconsin, American families invited German prisoners to share their meals, not just field rations, but sit-down dinners at the family table. They invited them to church services. They welcomed them into their homes. At Christmas and Thanksgiving, some families explicitly included prisoners in their celebrations, recognizing that these young men were far from their own families during holidays that emphasized family and home. The motivations behind this hospitality were complex. For German-American families, there was ethnic kinship and a desire to show that being American didn't mean abandoning all connection to German culture. For religious families, there were Christian values of hospitality and the recognition that even enemies deserved basic human compassion. For farming families who valued hard work, there was respect for prisoners who did their jobs well and appreciation for their contribution during a critical labor shortage. And for many Americans, there was simply the human impulse to be kind to young men who were lonely and far from home. The prisoners responded to this kindness with gratitude that often became devotion. They worked harder for farmers who treated them well. They carved gifts for children in families who had been kind to them. They learned English more eagerly when Americans were willing to help them practice. They formed attachments to places and people that would last long after the war ended. Former prisoner Günther Graeber, who returned to Joint Base Lewis McChord decades after his captivity just to say thank you, exemplified this gratitude. He rode his bicycle at age 91 from the Liberty Gate to the site of his former camp, escorted by military police, wanting to express his appreciation for treatment he had never expected from captors. The relationships that formed were not always between adults. Children played a particularly important role in humanizing the prisoners and breaking down barriers. American children, with their natural curiosity and lack of adult prejudices, often approached German prisoners without fear. They watched the prisoners work. They accepted small carved toys and other gifts. They practiced their limited German or helped prisoners practice English. For some children who grew up near POW camps, the presence of German prisoners was simply part of life, no more remarkable than any other aspect of their wartime childhood. These childhood interactions sometimes had profound effects on the prisoners. Men who had been taught that they were members of a master race, superior to other peoples, found themselves humbled and moved by the trust and kindness of American children, who saw them simply as interesting strangers who carved wooden toys or spoke a different language. The cognitive dissonance was powerful. How could these be the inferior, mongrel Americans of Nazi propaganda when their children showed such innocence and openness? Some relationships developed into genuine friendships that lasted long after the war. Prisoners and farmers exchanged addresses. When the prisoners were repatriated and found themselves struggling in devastated post-war Germany, they wrote to the American families they had known. Those American families, moved by the letters describing hardship and deprivation, sent care packages containing food, clothing, baby formula, things that were desperately scarce in post-war Germany, but relatively abundant in America. The Nebraska family, who had employed German prisoners, sent food and clothing to their former workers and eventually traveled to Germany to visit them. In Halton, Maine, a prisoner named von Micker returned to Germany after the war to find his country devastated and poverty-stricken. With an infant and wife to support, he wrote to the Aroostook County farmers he had known during his imprisonment. Those farmers, remembering the young German who had worked their fields and helped bring in their harvests, sent supplies, food, and baby formula. This was not required by any policy or law. It was simple human kindness extended across former battle lines. Recognition that wartime enemies could become, in peacetime, simply human beings in need of help. The correspondence between former prisoners and American families continued for decades in many cases. Letters crossed the Atlantic, sharing news of births and deaths, marriages and achievements, the ordinary fabric of human life. Some prisoners cited specific numbers, One man corresponded with 80 fellow prisoners who had all been positively affected by their American experience. These networks of correspondence kept alive the connections formed during the war and reinforced the positive impressions that many prisoners had formed of American society. Not all relationships were positive, of course. There were Americans who remained hostile to German prisoners throughout the war. There were instances of tension and conflict. In some communities, particularly those that had suffered casualties, resentment toward German prisoners ran deep. The government received hundreds of letters each week from Americans demanding harsher treatment for the prisoners, complaining that they were being coddled while American boys died overseas, insisting that they should be immediately executed rather than fed and housed at government expense. There were also instances of violence, though these were rare. An American guard at Camp Salina in Kansas, a man who had fought in the Battle of the Bulge and harbored deep hatred for Germans, loaded a machine gun one night and opened fire on the tents where German prisoners slept. 8 prisoners were killed, 20 wounded. The incident, known as the Midnight Massacre, stands as the worst massacre at a POW camp in United States history. But its very rarity underscores how unusual such violence was. The vast majority of interactions between American guards and German prisoners were professional and peaceful. The relationships between prisoners and African American soldiers were particularly complex and in some ways unexpected. Black American soldiers often guarded German prisoners, and many worked alongside them. The racial dynamics of wartime America created a situation where white German prisoners of war had access to facilities and privileges that Black American soldiers were denied due to Jim Crow segregation. German prisoners could enter restaurants in the South that their Black American guards could not. This cruel irony was not lost on anyone involved. Yet rather than creating hostility between German prisoners and Black Americans, this shared experience of marginalization often led to a kind of solidarity. Historian Matthias Reis has documented how German POWs and African American soldiers often developed unusually harmonious relationships, which were remarkably free of conflict. Both groups were doing Negro work, as it was called, the back-breaking agricultural labor of cotton picking, peanut harvesting, and pulpwood logging. Working side by side under these conditions, German prisoners and Black Americans found common ground as fellow sufferers, in the words used by both groups. This solidarity was not universal, and it should not be romanticized. Nazi racial ideology taught that black people were inferior, and some German prisoners retained these prejudices despite their experiences. But the shared experience of marginalization, of doing hard labor together, of being second class in different ways within American society, created bonds that crossed racial and national lines. For some German prisoners, working alongside black Americans challenged their Nazi indoctrination and forced them to recognize the humanity of people they had been taught to despise. The cumulative effect of all these relationships, these small human connections that defied official policy and challenged ideological boundaries, was profound. They humanized both Americans for Germans and Germans for Americans. They demonstrated that even in wartime, even between enemies, human connection is possible and perhaps necessary. They showed German prisoners that American democracy, whatever its flaws and contradictions, created space for human kindness and decency in ways that totalitarianism could not. Many former prisoners would later say that these relationships were more important to their transformation than any formal re-education program. The kindness of individual farmers, the trust shown by Americans who invited them into their homes, the generosity of families who sent care packages after the war, the simple humanity of guards who saw them as men rather than as monsters or abstract enemies, these experiences taught lessons that no amount of propaganda or formal instruction could have conveyed. When the time came for repatriation, when prisoners faced the prospect of leaving America and returning to a devastated Germany, many found themselves reluctant to go. They had formed attachments to places and people. They had experienced a way of life that felt more hopeful and more humane than what they had known. They had glimpsed a different future, one not based on authoritarian control and racial supremacy, but on individual freedom and human dignity. And while most would have to return whether they wanted to or not, these relationships ensured that they would carry America with them, not just as a memory, but as a model of what human society could be. The re-education, democracy in action. By the fall of 1943, American authorities faced a troubling realization. They were holding tens of thousands of German prisoners of war on American soil, with more arriving every month. Many of these prisoners remained committed Nazis, convinced of German superiority and ultimate German victory, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. When the war finally ended and these men returned to Germany, they would carry their Nazi ideology home with them. They might become the seeds of a resurgent German militarism, the nucleus of another attempt at conquest and domination. The mistake of World War I, when defeated, Germany was left to stew in resentment and nationalism, could not be repeated. The solution proposed was unprecedented and controversial, a formal program to re-educate German prisoners, to expose them to democratic values, to counteract Nazi propaganda, and to create a cohort of former POWs who would return to Germany as convinced Democrats rather than committed Nazis. This program would have to be carefully designed to avoid violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition on exposing prisoners to propaganda. It would have to overcome significant internal opposition from military officials who thought that changing adults' basic philosophies was impossible, and it would have to work despite the limited time available and the resistance of prisoners who remained loyal to Hitler. The Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, known as SPD, was established in March 1944 to implement what they called the Intellectual Diversion Program. The name itself reveals the covert nature of the effort. This was not officially re-education, which might violate international law and invite German retaliation against American prisoners. Instead, it was intellectual diversion, recreational and educational opportunities that just happened to expose prisoners to democratic values and counteract Nazi ideology. The program operated on multiple levels. The most visible was Der Ruf, which translates to The Call, a camp newspaper edited by sympathetic German prisoners, but guided by American authorities. The paper published articles, essays, stories, and commentary designed to present democratic values and American society in a favorable light without being so obvious as to trigger prisoner resistance or international criticism. The writing was sophisticated enough to appeal to educated prisoners while subtle enough to avoid being dismissed as crude propaganda. The camp libraries became another tool of re-education. SPD ensured that the libraries were stocked with books that had been banned in Nazi Germany. Works by anti-Nazi exile writers such as Erich Maria Remarque, whose All Quiet on the Western Front showed the horror and futility of war. Thomas Mann, whose The Magic Mountain explored European intellectual culture, and Franz Werfel, whose Song of Bernadette dealt with themes of faith and persecution. These books had been forbidden to ordinary Germans. So many prisoners were encountering them for the first time. The impact of access to this banned literature was sometimes profound. One prisoner, writing in Der Ruf, reflected that if they had only had the opportunity to read these books before the war, their entire introduction to life, war, and politics would have been different. The books offered alternative perspectives to Nazi ideology, perspectives from German writers who had rejected or fled the Third Reich. Reading these works in the quiet of camp libraries, prisoners could consider viewpoints that would have been dangerous or impossible to explore in Nazi Germany. The re-education program also made use of American newspapers and magazines, which were available in all camps. Prisoners could read about the war's progress from American perspectives, could see maps showing the steady Allied advance, could read casualty reports and production figures. More importantly, they could read about American society, democracy in action, the debates and discussions that characterize a free press. The contrast with the controlled German press, where all news was filtered through Goebbels' propaganda ministry, was stark and intentional. Educational courses expanded beyond practical subjects to include American history, civics, and government. Prisoners learned about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the structure of American democracy. They studied how a democratic society organizes itself, how power is distributed and checked, how individual rights are protected. The teaching was not heavy-handed indoctrination, but rather exposure to ideas and principles that stood in direct contrast to Nazi totalitarianism. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the re-education program was the showing of films documenting Nazi atrocities, particularly the Holocaust. After camps like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau were liberated in 1945, footage of the horrors discovered there was compiled into films that were shown to German prisoners under guard. The prisoners were required to watch. Armed military police stood present to prevent disruption or violence. The footage was so shocking that prisoners nicknamed them Knochen films, films of bones. The reaction to these atrocity films was complex and varied. Many prisoners were genuinely shocked and horrified. They had not known the full extent of the Holocaust. Nazi propaganda had hidden the systematic murder of millions from ordinary Germans and soldiers. Some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing, insisting it must be Allied propaganda and fake footage, but others were moved profoundly. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, after compulsory viewing of an atrocity film, 1,000 prisoners burned their German uniforms in a massive pile, a symbolic rejection of everything those uniforms represented. At other camps, prisoners called on Germany to surrender, recognizing that the regime they had fought for was guilty of crimes beyond comprehension. A few prisoners even volunteered to fight against Japan, offering to switch sides completely, though this offer was considered but ultimately rejected by American authorities. The atrocity films forced prisoners to confront the reality of Nazi evil in a way that nothing else could, and for many, this confrontation shattered any remaining loyalty to the regime. After VE Day, when the war in Europe ended, SPD accelerated its efforts with intensive democracy courses for the most cooperative and receptive prisoners. These rapid classes, held at special facilities like Fort Kearny and Fort Eustis, provided concentrated education in democratic principles and American society. 25,000 prisoners graduated from these intensive courses, and they were repatriated directly to Germany rather than being kept for additional labor in Europe. The hope was that they would form the nucleus of a democratic post-war Germany, carrying what they had learned back to their devastated homeland. The success of the re-education program is difficult to measure definitively. Many within the office of the provost, Marshal General, opposed the program from the start. They argued that changing the basic philosophies and values of adults was impossible or very unlikely. They worried that successful re-education might push prisoners toward communism as an alternative to both Nazism and capitalism. Some thought that the effort was a waste of resources that could be better used elsewhere. And surveys of prisoners showed that formal re-education had limited impact on the views of most prisoners who participated. But these surveys and critiques may have missed the more subtle and powerful forms of re-education that were happening every day in the camps and on the work sites. The humane treatment prisoners received, the abundance they observed, the kindness shown by individual Americans, the exposure to uncensored information, the access to banned books, the observation of democracy in action, these formed an ongoing, lived experience re-education that was probably more effective than any formal program could be. Former prisoners themselves testified to this effect. Felix Funke, who corresponded with 80 fellow prisoners after returning home, reported that no formal re-education had been necessary in the camps. Instead, the prisoners had become convinced Democrats simply due to the treatment they received. The experience of living in a democratic society, even as prisoners, even with all its imperfections and contradictions, taught them lessons that ideological instruction never could have. The re-education program represented a significant gamble. It bet that exposure to democratic values and humane treatment could transform enemy soldiers into potential allies for democracy in post-war Germany. It wagered that human beings, even those thoroughly indoctrinated in totalitarian ideology, could learn and change when confronted with alternative ways of organizing society. And it accepted the risk that the effort might fail, that prisoners might return to Germany as committed Nazis ready to continue the struggle. In retrospect, the program succeeded far more than its critics expected, though probably not in the ways its designers intended. The formal aspects of re-education, the courses and newspapers and films, had mixed results. But the informal re-education that happened through daily life in America, through work on American farms, through relationships with American people, through the simple experience of humane treatment and exposure to prosperity and freedom, this proved transformative for thousands of prisoners. When these men returned to Germany and faced the choice between Western democracy and Soviet communism, between integration with the West and alignment with the East, many chose democracy. Some became prominent figures in post-war West Germany, bringing their understanding of democratic values to the work of reconstruction. Thousands emigrated to the United States, seeking to return permanently to the country where they had been prisoners. And even those who remained in Germany often became, in effect, ambassadors for democratic values, carrying with them the memory of an alternative to totalitarian control. The re-education program's greatest success may have been unintentional. By treating prisoners humanely, by following the Geneva Convention even when it was inconvenient, by demonstrating that democratic societies could maintain their principles, even toward enemies. America provided a living lesson in democratic values that no amount of formal instruction could have matched. The prisoners learned about democracy not by being told about it, but by experiencing it, however imperfectly and incompletely, during their years on American soil. The reality of post-war Germany. While German prisoners in America lived in relative comfort and abundance, their homeland was being systematically destroyed. The contrast between their experience and the reality awaiting them in Germany would become one of the most important factors in their reluctance to be repatriated. To understand why so many prisoners wanted to stay in America, we must understand what they were being asked to return to. By 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Allied bombing campaigns and ground battles had devastated the nation's infrastructure and cities. An estimated 1/4 of the country's housing was destroyed or damaged beyond use, and in many major cities, the toll exceeded 50%. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Entire urban centres had been reduced to landscapes of rubble and shattered buildings. The physical devastation was almost incomprehensible in its scale. Millions of Germans were homeless, living in cellars, in hovels, in bombed-out buildings, anywhere they could find even minimal shelter from the elements. The destruction of infrastructure went beyond just buildings. Germany's transportation systems had largely ceased to function. Railroads were bombed, bridges destroyed, roads cratered. Factories stood damaged or demolished, their machinery looted or dismantled as reparations. The economic system had collapsed completely. Rampant inflation made the German currency worthless. Black markets became the only reliable way to obtain basic necessities. The normal mechanisms of commerce and trade had broken down entirely. But the physical destruction, terrible as it was, paled in comparison to the human suffering. The food situation in Germany became catastrophic. Food production per capita in 1947 was only 51% of its level in 1938. The official food ration set by the occupying powers varied between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day, well below what is needed to maintain health and the ability to work. In the British occupation zone, rations had to be reduced to a near starvation level of 1,000 calories per day in March 1946. The German population was literally starving. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was particularly brutal. Not only were food supplies critically short, but fuel for heating was almost non-existent. Germans froze in their inadequate shelters while slowly starving on insufficient rations. Disease spread through the weakened population. In early October 1945, the United Kingdom government privately acknowledged in a cabinet meeting that German civilian adult death rates had risen to 4 times pre-war levels, and death rates among German children had risen by 10 times pre-war levels. The human cost of Germany's defeat was staggering. The occupation by Allied forces created its own set of problems. Germany was divided into 4 zones, controlled respectively by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin itself, though located deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided among the 4 powers. This division created administrative chaos and, more importantly, set the stage for the Cold War division that would split Germany for the next 45 years. The Soviet occupation zone presented particular horrors. The Red Army had entered Germany with a burning desire for revenge after the devastation Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. Soviet soldiers committed widespread atrocities, including mass rape of German women and brutal treatment of German civilians. Soviet occupation authorities seized entire factories as reparations, dismantling them and shipping them back to the Soviet Union. They imposed a communist system on their zone, forcing the merger of Social Democrats with Communists to create the Socialist Unity Party that would rule East Germany for decades. For prisoners from what would become East Germany, the prospect of return was particularly terrifying. They faced not just physical devastation and starvation, but communist rule and possible imprisonment or forced labor for having served in the Wehrmacht. Some prisoners from areas that had been part of Eastern Germany but were now incorporated into Poland or the Soviet Union faced the reality that their homes no longer existed, that their families had been expelled or killed, that they literally had nothing to return to. The contrast with what prisoners were experiencing in America could not have been more stark. In America, they ate 3 substantial meals a day, meals that included meat, vegetables, dairy, bread, even desserts. In Germany, people were starving on rations of 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day. In America, prisoners lived in heated barracks with electric lights, running water, medical care when needed. In Germany, people huddled in bombed-out buildings without heat, without electricity, often without clean water or sanitation. In America, prisoners could earn wages and buy extras at camp canteens. In Germany, money was worthless, and most goods could be obtained only through black market barter. Letters from home brought the reality of German suffering directly to the prisoners. Family members wrote, carefully, knowing that censors would read every word, but even through the cautious language the message was clear. Things are terrible here. Food is scarce. Housing is damaged or destroyed. The future looks bleak. Prisoners read these letters with growing anxiety and dread, understanding that they would eventually have to return to this devastated landscape. American soldiers who entered Germany in 1945 and 1946 sent back reports that confirmed the prisoners' worst fears. One army officer wrote of entering Hamburg and seeing, as far as the eye could see, just devastation. What had obviously once been lovely buildings were now just ruins, shattered walls, great tumbles of stone, and a population seemingly staggering about like tired zombies. Another described the stench of hundreds of bodies still awaiting burial, the apocalyptic landscape of a once great nation reduced to rubble. The economic policies of the occupation made recovery even more difficult initially. The so-called Morgenthau Plan, influenced by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau's belief that Germany should be reduced to an agricultural nation to prevent future war, meant that industrial capacity was deliberately limited. The first industrial plan for Germany, signed in 1946, required the destruction of 1,500 manufacturing plants. Steel production was capped at about 25% of pre-war levels. Car production was set to 10% of pre-war levels. Germany was to be reduced to the standard of life it had known at the height of the Great Depression. These policies, combined with the physical destruction and population displacement, created conditions of immense suffering. Germans who had any marketable skills or resources tried desperately to emigrate, to leave the devastation behind and start over somewhere else. But for most Germans, there was no choice. They had to stay and somehow survive, somehow rebuild from ruins, somehow create a future from the ashes of total defeat. Against this backdrop, the reluctance of German prisoners in America to be repatriated becomes entirely understandable. They were being asked to leave relative comfort and abundance to return to starvation and devastation. They were being asked to leave a country where they had experienced prosperity and humane treatment to return to one where survival itself would be a daily struggle. They were being asked to leave the hope they had glimpsed in America for the bleak despair of occupied Germany. The timing of repatriation made it even more difficult. While hostilities ended in May 1945, the repatriation of German prisoners from the United States didn't begin until November 1945 and continued through 1946. This meant that prisoners remained in America throughout the first, worst year of post-war German suffering. They read letters describing the terrible winter of 1945 to 1946. They heard reports of the starvation rations. They learned that things were not getting better quickly, but seemed to be getting worse. Moreover, the repatriation process itself was not direct. Many prisoners were not returned directly to Germany, but were instead transferred to Britain or France to work on reconstruction efforts in those countries before being finally released to return to Germany. This meant additional months or even years of labour before they could go home, months during which conditions in Germany remained desperate. The prisoners in America watched their homeland's agony from a position of relative safety and comfort. They ate well while their families starved. They lived in adequate housing while their homes were destroyed. They earned small wages and bought luxuries while their countrymen bartered whatever they had for basic necessities. The guilt they felt must have been tremendous, mixed with the fear of what awaited them and the desire to somehow help their families from across the Atlantic. Some prisoners took action. They pooled their earnings to send money home, though getting money into devastated Germany was difficult. They tried to arrange for American Red Cross parcels to be sent to their families. They wrote letters offering what encouragement and information they could. But mostly, they could only wait, knowing that eventually the order would come. They would be loaded onto ships, they would cross the Atlantic again, and they would face the ruins of their homeland. The reality of post-war Germany is essential to understanding the prisoner experience in America. The contrast between American abundance and German devastation, between American hope and German despair, between the relative normalcy of camp life in America and the apocalyptic conditions in Germany, this contrast made America seem even more remarkable and made the prospect of return even more daunting. When prisoners finally did return and encountered the full reality of what their country had become, many would look back on their time in American captivity not as punishment, but as a strange kind of blessing, a period of safety and learning during the worst years of German suffering. The reluctant return, the autumn of 1945, brought victory for the Allies, and with it, the beginning of the end of the prisoner of war camps in America. The war was over. The German military had surrendered unconditionally. Nazi Germany had ceased to exist, replaced by occupied zones administered by the victorious powers. The time had come for the 425,000 German prisoners on American soil to go home. But for many of these men, that order to return was the thing they had come to dread most. The repatriation began in November 1945, with the aim of sending 50,000 prisoners per month back to Europe. The process was complicated and slow. The prisoners first had to be gathered from the hundreds of camps and branch camps scattered across 46 states. They had to be processed, their records reviewed, their accounts settled. Many prisoners had accumulated substantial savings from their work, hundreds of dollars in accounts that the government would pay out before their departure. Some had possessions they wanted to take with them, artwork they had created, carved objects, letters, books, memories of their years in America. The mood in the camps as repatriation approached was complex and varied. Some prisoners were eager to return despite everything. They missed their families desperately. They wanted to help with the reconstruction of their homeland. They felt a duty to return and contribute to whatever Germany was becoming. These men boarded the transport ships with determination, ready to face whatever awaited them, hopeful that things could not be as bad as the letters and reports suggested. But many others were deeply reluctant. They had grown attached to America. They had formed relationships with guards, with farmers, with local families. They had glimpsed a way of life that seemed more hopeful and more humane than what they had known. They had experienced prosperity and democratic values firsthand. They knew what awaited them in Germany: devastation, starvation, occupation, the grinding work of reconstruction from ruins. Some openly expressed their desire to stay, asking if there was any way they could remain in America rather than be forced to return. American authorities were sympathetic to these requests, but ultimately unwilling to allow prisoners to stay. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners after the war's end. There were also practical considerations. American labor unions demanded that prisoners leave to make jobs available for returning American soldiers. The new president, Harry Truman, never one to mince words, simply ordered the War Department to ship the prisoners out of the United States, to whichever country would take them. The prisoners would have to go, whether they wanted to or not. The exceptions were vanishingly rare. No official mechanism existed for prisoners to remain in America after the war. The approximately 1% of German prisoners who did manage to stay in America did so through unofficial and sometimes illegal means. Some had escaped from camps and successfully disappeared into American society, taking new identities and starting over. Others married American women during their captivity, though this was against regulations, and managed to leverage these relationships into permission to stay. But for the vast majority, return was inevitable and increasingly imminent. As the transport ships began carrying prisoners back across the Atlantic, emotional scenes played out in camps across America. Prisoners said goodbye to guards they had come to know. They thanked farmers who had treated them well, promised to write, exchanged addresses. Some American families who had grown close to particular prisoners openly wept to see them go. The bonds that had formed over months and years of daily contact proved deeper than anyone had expected. In Moorhead, Minnesota, the German prisoners who had worked for farmer Henry Peterson expressed profound gratitude for his kindness and fair treatment. Peterson had bent rules to show them small kindnesses, buying them beer, taking them to movies and taverns, treating them as human beings rather than just labor. As they prepared to leave, several prisoners asked for his help in becoming American citizens someday, if that became possible. Many wrote to him after returning to Germany, maintaining the connection that had meant so much to them. The journey back across the Atlantic was very different from the journey that had brought them to America years before. Then, they had been defeated soldiers, uncertain of their fate, afraid of what their captors might do to them. Now they were returning home, but with mixed emotions. They were leaving a country that had treated them surprisingly well to return to one that lay in ruins. They carried with them American experiences, American values, American memories that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many prisoners were not sent directly back to Germany. Instead, they were transferred to Britain or France to work on reconstruction efforts in those countries. This was partly pragmatic Britain, and France needed labour for rebuilding, and partly punitive, a way of making German prisoners contribute to repairing the damage their nation had inflicted. These prisoners spent months or sometimes years working in British or French camps before finally being released to return to Germany. For them, the the return was even further delayed, even more dreaded. The reception that awaited returning prisoners in Germany was often harsh. They came home to families that had suffered tremendously while they had been relatively safe in America. There was sometimes resentment that they had eaten well while loved ones starved, that they had been warm while families froze, that they had been out of danger while Germany burned. The prisoners tried to explain, tried to describe their experiences, but the gulf between what they had lived through and what their families had endured was almost too wide to bridge. Moreover, returning prisoners faced immediate practical problems. Where would they live when so much housing was destroyed? How would they survive when food was so scarce? What work could they do when so much of Germany's economy lay in ruins? Some had skills they had learned in America that would prove valuable: English language ability, knowledge of American agricultural techniques, experience with machinery and tools. But in the immediate post-war period, such skills mattered less than simple survival. The accounts prisoners had accumulated from their work provided some help. Several $100s, converted to whatever currency was functioning in their zone of occupation, could be a significant asset in the immediate post-war period. It could buy food on the black market, secure temporary housing, provide a cushion while they search for work. But no amount of money could quickly repair the devastation or ease the massive disruption to normal life. For prisoners from areas that had become part of East Germany or had been incorporated into Poland or the Soviet Union, return was even more complicated. They could not go back to their hometowns and homes that no longer existed or existed under communist rule. They had to start over entirely, finding new places to live in a shrunken Germany, trying to track down family members who had been displaced, creating new lives from nothing. Some prisoners facing these prospects chose not to return at all. Georg Gardner became the most famous of these. Captured by the British in Tunisia in 1943 and brought to America, Gardner was terrified at the thought of being repatriated to his hometown of Schweidnitz in Silesia, which had become part of communist Poland. On September 21st, 1945, after the war had ended, he escaped from Camp Deming in New Mexico. He successfully disappeared into American society, taking the identity of Dennis F. Wiles, and remained free for 40 years. Gardner worked various jobs under his false identity: dishwasher, cook, laborer, eventually construction estimator. He lived in California, worked in Hawaii, settled eventually in Colorado. He married an American woman, though he could never fully reveal his past to her. He lived as a fugitive for 4 decades, always aware that he might be discovered, always knowing that his life was built on a lie. But he preferred this precarious existence to the prospect of being sent to communist-controlled territory. Finally, in 1985, at the age of 64, Gardner came forward and revealed his true identity. By then, his hometown was firmly part of Poland. His parents had died years before, and he had spent more of his life in America than he ever had in Germany. When he went public, the authorities were bewildered about what to charge him with. He hadn't been an illegal immigrant since he had been brought to America against his will. He hadn't really escaped from prison since the war had ended. No one seemed quite sure what law he had broken, if any. In the end, he was not charged with any offense and was allowed to remain in America, finally legal after 40 years of hiding. Gardner's story, while extreme, illustrates the lengths some prisoners were willing to go to avoid being sent back. For him, and for others, America represented hope and possibility in a way that post-war Germany simply could not. The experience of living in America, even as a prisoner, had transformed him to the point where he was willing to live as a fugitive rather than return to a homeland that had been lost to communist occupation. Most prisoners, of course, did not escape. They returned as ordered, crossed the Atlantic again, and faced the ruins of Germany. The contrast between the America they left and the Germany they found shocked even those who thought they were prepared. The devastation was worse than they had imagined. The suffering was more widespread. The prospects for recovery seemed more distant. They had left camps where they ate 3 meals a day to return to a country where people survived on starvation rations. They had left relative normalcy to return to apocalyptic chaos, but they also carried with them something valuable, a vision of an alternative. They had seen how a democratic society functioned. They had experienced prosperity and the rule of law. They had been treated as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. They had glimpsed a different future for Germany, one based on democratic values rather than authoritarian control, on prosperity built through freedom rather than conquest, on cooperation with the West rather than opposition to it. This vision, carried home by thousands of former prisoners, would help shape post-war Germany in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The reluctant return of German prisoners from America marks the end of their physical captivity, but in many ways, the beginning of their more lasting impact. They came home, changed men. They brought with them experiences and perspectives that would influence their choices in the years ahead. And many of them never stopped looking back across the Atlantic at the country where they had been prisoners, but where they had also, in some strange way, been free. Transformations, changed men. When German prisoners returned from America to their devastated homeland, they brought with them more than just physical possessions and accumulated wages. They carried back experiences that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world, of politics, of what was possible for human society. The transformation that occurred during their years in American captivity would have lasting effects on both the former prisoners as individuals and on post-war Germany as a nation. The evidence of this transformation came in many forms. Felix Funke, a former prisoner who returned to Germany and maintained correspondence with 80 fellow former POWs, reported that the re-education programs had been largely unnecessary. Not because the prisoners had rejected re-education efforts, but because they had already become convinced Democrats simply due to the treatment they received in America. The humane treatment, the exposure to American prosperity, the observation of democracy in action, these had accomplished what formal re-education programs might have struggled to achieve. This transformation was not universal. Some prisoners returned to Germany and quickly readjusted to German life without carrying forward any particular attachment to democratic values or American methods. Some had remained committed Nazis throughout their captivity and saw no reason to change their views just because Germany had lost the war. The hardcore believers who had intimidated other prisoners, who had carried out the Holy Ghost murders, who had resisted re-education efforts at every turn, these men often remained unchanged by their American experience. But for thousands of others, the transformation was real and lasting. They had experienced cognitive dissonance between Nazi propaganda and American reality too profound to ignore. They had seen too much, learned too much, experienced too much to simply return to their old ways of thinking. The seeds of doubt that had been planted in their minds during their captivity now grew in the fertile soil of post-war German reconstruction. The most immediate expression of this transformation was the choice that former prisoners made about Germany's future orientation. In the early post-war years, it was not yet clear whether Germany would align with the West or with the Soviet Union, whether it would embrace democracy or communism. Former prisoners who had experienced American democracy, imperfect as it was, generally chose the Western democratic path. They supported political parties that favored integration with the West rather than the East. They advocated for market economies rather than communist control. They believed in democratic governance rather than totalitarian rule. Some former prisoners became prominent figures in post-war West German politics, business, and civil society. They brought their understanding of democratic processes, gained through observation during their captivity, to the work of building new institutions. They served as a bridge between American democratic values and German political culture, helping to translate American concepts into German contexts. They were not numerous enough to determine Germany's future alone, but they were influential enough to help tip the balance toward Western integration and democratic governance. The transformation was visible in smaller, more personal ways as well. Former prisoners who had learned English in camp and had practiced it with American guards and farmers put that skill to use in post-war Germany. As the American occupation proceeded and as economic ties with America developed, English became an increasingly valuable skill. Former POWs who spoke English found work as translators, as liaisons between American authorities and German civilians, as early employees of American companies beginning operations in Germany. Former prisoners who had observed American agricultural techniques and American industrial organization brought that knowledge back to German farms and factories. They had seen how American farmers use mechanized equipment efficiently. They had observed how American businesses organize production. They had experienced American work culture, which was different from German traditions but often more productive. As Germany began its economic recovery, these observations and experiences contributed to the adoption of more efficient methods. The letters that flowed between former prisoners and the American families they had known created ongoing connections that helped sustain these transformations. When former prisoners wrote to American farmers requesting help in becoming American citizens, they were expressing a desire to return to the country that had changed them. When American families sent care packages to Germany to help former prisoners and their families survive the post-war deprivation, they were reinforcing the relationships that had formed during the war. These letters and packages served as reminders of the American way of life, keeping alive the memories and values that prisoners had absorbed. Some former prisoners took the transformation to its logical conclusion and emigrated to America once conditions permitted. Approximately 5,000 Germans who had been prisoners of war eventually immigrated to the United States. Many did so with the help and sponsorship of the very farmers who had employed them during their captivity. These farmers remembered hard-working young Germans who had helped bring in their harvests, who had become almost like family during those wartime years. When those young Germans wanted to return to America permanently, the farmers were often willing to sponsor them, to vouch for their character, to help them navigate the complex immigration process. Thousands more former prisoners returned to America to visit, even if they didn't immigrate permanently. They came back to see the places where they had been held, to visit the families they had known, to show their own children and grandchildren the country that had changed their lives. These return visits, sometimes occurring decades after the war, testified to the lasting impact of the POW experience. Men in their 70s and 80s made the journey across the Atlantic, driven by a desire to say thank you to America one more time. Günter Grave's return visit at age 91 exemplifies this phenomenon. He rode his bicycle from the Liberty Gate to the site of his former POW barracks at Joint Base Lewis McChord, escorted by military police, wanting to express his gratitude for treatment he described as excellent, despite being a prisoner of war. He had no complaints about his time in captivity. Instead, he remembered the food, the opportunities to buy ice cream and Coca-Cola, the fair treatment, the exposure to American prosperity. His visit was a pilgrimage of sorts, a return to a place that had been transformative in his youth. The transformation also manifested in how former prisoners raised their own children. They told stories about their time in America. They taught their children that democracy was not weak or chaotic, but could be strong and productive. They shared their observations about American prosperity and what created it. They passed on the values they had absorbed: fairness, individual, dignity, the rule of law, the possibility of prosperity through freedom rather than conquest. This generational transmission helped ensure that the transformation had effects beyond just the former prisoners themselves. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, built on many factors: currency reform, Marshall Plan aid, the hard work of the German people, wise policies by German leaders. But it also built on attitudes and values that had been shaped partly by exposure to American prosperity and American methods. Former POWs were among those who had seen American abundance firsthand, who had observed American efficiency, who had learned that prosperity was possible without imperialism or aggression. While they were not the primary drivers of the economic miracle, they contributed to creating a cultural environment receptive to Western economic models. The political stability of West Germany, its successful integration into Western democratic institutions, its eventual reconciliation with former enemies, all these developments owed something to the changed attitudes of men who had experienced American captivity. They helped create a political culture that rejected the authoritarian and militaristic traditions that had led to 2 world wars. They supported leaders who favored democracy, peace, and Western integration. They opposed those who wanted to return to German nationalism and militarism. Perhaps most importantly, the transformation helped Germany learn from its catastrophic mistakes. The former prisoners had seen what Nazi ideology had produced: total defeat, complete devastation, a nation in ruins. They had also seen what democratic values and peaceful prosperity looked like. The choice between these 2 paths was stark and clear. By choosing democracy and Western integration, Germany avoided the fate that had befallen it after World War I, when resentment and nationalism had eventually led to an even more terrible conflict. The transformation of German POWs in America represents one of the most remarkable outcomes of the Second World War. Enemy soldiers, captured on battlefields and brought to America as prisoners, returned home as changed men who would help build a democratic Germany aligned with the West. This outcome was not inevitable. It resulted from deliberate choices about how to treat prisoners, from adherence to international law even in wartime, from countless small acts of human kindness that accumulated into a larger transformation. It proved that even in the midst of total war, even between bitter enemies, the possibility of human transformation exists, and that the seeds of future peace can be planted in the most unlikely soil. Legacy: those who came back, The story of German prisoners of war in America did not end with repatriation in 1946. In many ways, that was just the beginning of a longer story about relationships that endured, about men who returned to the country where they had been captives, about a legacy that continues to this day in ways both large and small. The most visible part of this legacy consists of the approximately 5,000 former German POWs who eventually emigrated to the United States. These men took different paths to immigration, but many shared a common pattern. After being repatriated to Germany, they struggled through the immediate post-war years, contributing to the reconstruction of their homeland while never forgetting their time in America. As conditions in Germany stabilized and as immigration to America became more feasible, they applied for visas and sought sponsors who could vouch for them. Often, these sponsors were the very farmers who had employed them as prisoners. American farmers in Nebraska, Minnesota, Texas, Wisconsin, and dozens of other states remembered the German POWs who had worked their fields during the war. They remembered young men who had worked hard, who had become almost like family, who had shared meals at their tables and played with their children. When those young Germans wrote asking for help in coming to America, the farmers frequently agreed to sponsor them, to provide the necessary documentation and assurances that would allow immigration officials to approve their applications. Hans Wecker represents this pattern. A former prisoner at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, who described his treatment as excellent and who never forgot the golden cage of American POW camps, eventually returned to the United States and settled in Maine, where he had a successful career as a physician. His return to America was not a flight from Germany, but rather a choice to live in a country whose values and way of life he had come to admire during his captivity. Other former prisoners came back not as immigrants, but as visitors, returning to see the places where they had been held, to reconnect with people they had known, to show their families the America that had changed their lives. These return visits often garnered local attention, with newspapers covering the reunions between former prisoners and the guards who had watched them, or the farmers who had employed them. The stories revealed that the relationships formed during the war had endured across decades and across the Atlantic, maintained through letters and memories, and finally renewed through personal visits. Some former prisoners became prominent figures in post-war Germany and used their positions to strengthen German-American relations. Rüdiger von Wechmar, who had been a POW in America, later served as the German permanent representative to the United Nations in New York City for 14 years. His time in American captivity had given him understanding of American society that proved valuable in diplomatic work. He was not alone. Other former prisoners became business leaders, politicians, educators, and civil servants who brought their understanding of America to their work and who helped build the close relationship between West Germany and the United States that characterized the post-war period. Reunions between former prisoners and their American captors or employers became a regular feature of the legacy. In Louisiana, Maine, Georgia, and other states, communities that had hosted POW camps organized reunions bringing together former prisoners, former guards, and local residents who remembered the wartime camps. These gatherings featured shared meals, reminiscences, tours of former campsites, and renewed friendships. Local media coverage of these reunions helped preserve the history of the camps and reminded communities of this unusual chapter in their local history. The physical remnants of the POW camps gradually disappeared. Most camps were dismantled after the war, their buildings sold at auction or repurposed. The barracks became homes or farm structures, Campsites became airports, college campuses, industrial parks, or simply returned to farmland. By the late 20th century, very few visible traces of the camps remained. Even in communities that had hosted large camps, local residents often did not know the camps had ever existed. This forgetting troubled some former prisoners and some historians who recognized the significance of the POW experience. Efforts began to preserve the memory and mark the sites where camps had stood. Museums in some states created exhibits about the POW camps. Historical societies collected oral histories from former prisoners and from Americans who had known them. Markers were placed at some former campsites. Books and documentaries told the story to audiences who had never known this history existed. The 860 German POWs who died during their captivity in America and who remain buried at 43 sites across the United States represent another visible part of the legacy. These graves, often tended by local German-American organizations and historical societies, serve as poignant reminders of men who never made it home. They died from disease, from accidents, from the murders committed by fellow prisoners, from the wounds they had sustained in combat. Their graves receive visitors still, former prisoners who come to pay respects to comrades, descendants seeking to understand their family history, historians documenting this chapter of the war. The legacy extends beyond individuals to the broader historical lessons of the POW experience. The story of German prisoners in America has been cited in debates about how to treat prisoners of war and enemy combatants in modern conflicts. When questions arose about the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay, some pointed to the German POW camps of World War II as precedents for humane treatment that yielded strategic benefits. The adherence to Geneva Convention standards, the provision of adequate food and shelter, the opportunities for work and education, these approaches were held up as examples of how democratic nations should treat even enemy combatants. The success of these methods in creating convinced Democrats out of enemy soldiers has been noted by those who study counterinsurgency and post-conflict reconstruction. The transformation of German POWs suggests that humane treatment and exposure to democratic values can change attitudes even among those who have been thoroughly indoctrinated in totalitarian ideology. This lesson has relevance far beyond World War II, offering insights into how former enemies might be reconciled and how destructive ideologies might be countered. The POW experience also offers lessons about the nature of propaganda versus lived experience. The German prisoners arrived believing Nazi propaganda about American cultural inferiority, American weakness, American barbarism. They encountered instead American prosperity, American strength, and American humanity. The dissonance between what they had been told and what they experienced proved more powerful than any amount of counter-propaganda. The lesson is that actions speak louder than words, that how a society treats even its enemies reveals its true character more clearly than any amount of rhetoric. The relationships that formed between German prisoners and American civilians demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, human connection is possible across enemy lines. The farmers who invited prisoners to their tables, the guards who shared cigarettes and family photos, the families who sent care packages to Germany after the war, all exemplified human kindness that transcended the categories of friend and enemy. In an age of increasingly polarized politics and demonization of opponents, these examples of human connection, despite ideological differences, offer a kind of hope. For the local communities that hosted POW camps, the legacy is more ambiguous. Some communities have embraced this history, recognizing it as a unique and significant part of their local story. They've created museums, preserved artifacts, collected oral histories, and celebrated the unusual connections that formed between their communities and German prisoners during the war. Other communities have largely forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, allowing the camps to fade from memory and the sites to be absorbed into other uses. The descendants of German POWs sometimes seek to understand their fathers' or grandfathers' experiences. They travel to America to visit the sites where their relatives were held. They search archives for records. They try to understand how this period of captivity shaped the men their relatives became. For some families, the American POW experience is a source of pride, evidence that their relative was treated honorably and learned valuable lessons. For others, it's simply a curiosity, a strange footnote in family history that reveals how war can create unexpected connections. The academic study of German POWs in America has grown over the decades, with historians recognizing this as a significant and understudied aspect of World War II history. Dissertations, articles, and books have examined various aspects of the POW experience: the camps themselves, the work programs, the re-education efforts, the relationships with local communities, the legacy in post-war Germany. This scholarship has helped preserve the story and analyze its significance, ensuring that even as the last survivors pass away, the history will not be lost. The broader legacy may be most visible in the strong German-American relationship that developed in the post-war period. West Germany became one of America's closest allies, a reliable partner in NATO, a key player in European integration, and an economic powerhouse aligned with the West. This outcome was not inevitable. Germany might have remained resentful and revanchist, as it had after World War I. The fact that it instead became a democratic ally owes something to many factors, but the experience of German POWs in America was one of those factors, creating a cohort of men who had seen American democracy firsthand and who supported Western integration. Today, as the last survivors of the POW experience enter their 90s and beyond, there is urgency to preserve their stories before they are lost forever. Oral history projects seek to record the memories of former prisoners and of Americans who knew them. The testimony of men like Günter Graver, who return to say thank you, reminds us that human kindness has lasting effects, that treatment of prisoners matters, and that even in wartime, the possibility of transformation exists. The legacy of German POWs in America is ultimately a story about the power of humane treatment, about the possibility of human transformation, about how enemies can become, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings worthy of dignity and respect. It's a story that offers hope in a world that often seems divided beyond reconciliation, demonstrating that even the deepest ideological and national differences can be bridged through human connection and fair treatment. And it's a reminder that how we treat even our enemies says something fundamental about who we are and what we value as a society. Conclusion. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this remarkable chapter of history we've explored together. 425,000 German prisoners of war came to America between 1943 and 1946. They came as enemies, captured soldiers of a regime that represented everything America was fighting against. They expected brutal treatment, perhaps death. What they found instead changed many of them forever. they discovered a nation of abundance they had been told did not exist. They experienced humane treatment from a people they had been taught to despise. They observed democracy in action, imperfect and complicated, but fundamentally different from the totalitarianism they had known. They worked alongside Americans who showed them kindness despite the war that raged across oceans. They ate well while their families starved. They lived in relative comfort while their homeland burned. And when the time came to return, many wanted to stay. The story of these prisoners is not primarily about military history or wartime logistics. It's about human transformation. It's about what happens when propaganda meets reality, when ideology confronts lived experience, when enemies are forced to recognize each other's humanity. It's about young men raised in totalitarian ideology who discovered through their own eyes that another way of organizing society was possible and perhaps better. The kindness that American farmers showed to German prisoners, the meals shared at American tables, the Christmas carols sung together, the care packages sent to Germany after the war. These small acts of human connection had effects that rippled far beyond the individuals involved. They helped create a generation of Germans who returned home as convinced Democrats, who supported Western integration, who rejected the militarism and authoritarianism that had led their nation to ruin. They planted seeds that would grow into the strong German-American relationship that helped define the post-war world. This is not to romanticize the experience or ignore its complexities. Not every prisoner was transformed. Some remained committed Nazis. Some prisoners murdered other prisoners for insufficient loyalty to the regime. Some Americans remained hostile to all Germans throughout the war. The treatment of prisoners varied widely from camp to camp. An American democracy itself had profound flaws, particularly around race, that prisoners could not help but notice. But the overall pattern is clear and remarkable. A nation at war treated its enemy prisoners with humanity and respect, adhered to international law even when it was inconvenient, and demonstrated through actions rather than just words the values it claimed to represent. Those prisoners witnessing this treatment, observing American abundance, experiencing democratic society firsthand, were changed. Not all, but many. Enough to matter. Enough to help shape post-war Germany. Enough that thousands wanted to return to America permanently, and thousands more maintain connections across decades and across the Atlantic. The legacy continues today in the strong relationship between Germany and America, in the democratic stability of post-war Germany, in the individual stories of former prisoners and the families and communities who knew them. It continues in the 860 graves scattered across 43 states, in the museums and historical markers at former campsites, in the reunions that bring together former prisoners and former guards now in their 90s, in the oral histories preserved before the last survivors pass away. What can we learn from this history? Perhaps that how we treat even our enemies matters, not just for moral reasons, but for practical strategic ones. The humane treatment of German prisoners helped create a post-war Germany aligned with the West rather than seeking revenge or falling under Soviet influence. Perhaps that propaganda cannot withstand lived experience indefinitely. Nazi ideology told prisoners that Americans were cultural inferiors and barbarians. Daily contact with actual Americans proved this false. Perhaps that human connection is possible even across the deepest divides. Farmers and prisoners, guards and captives found common ground and sometimes even friendship, despite being on opposite sides of a total war. The story also reminds us of the power of abundance and prosperity to demonstrate the value of freedom. The German prisoners saw American wealth not as the product of imperialism or oppression, but as the result of democratic capitalism and individual liberty. This observation, repeated hundreds of thousands of times over 3 years, helped convince them that prosperity was possible without aggressive expansion, that freedom could be productive rather than chaotic, that democracy could be strong rather than weak. As you slip into sleep, remember those young German soldiers standing in front of camp stores trying to decide between ice cream and Coca-Cola, amazed at choices they had never had before. Remember the American farmers who invited enemy soldiers to their dinner tables and treated them as human beings rather than as monsters. Remember the guards who shared cigarettes and photographs of their families. Remember the Christmas carols sung together by former enemies. Remember the care packages sent across the Atlantic after the war to help former prisoners survive in ruined Germany. Remember the 91-year-old man who rode his bicycle back to his former prison camp just to say thank you. These memories, these human moments of connection and kindness and transformation, are the heart of this story. They remind us that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of total war, even between bitter enemies, human connection is possible and powerful. They show us that humane treatment has effects beyond the immediate moment, planting seeds that grow over years and decades. They demonstrate that people can learn and change, that ideology can be overcome by experience, that enemies can become, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. So rest well tonight, knowing this story. Let it remind you that transformation is possible, that kindness matters, that how we treat even those we consider enemies says something fundamental about who we are. The German prisoners who begged America to keep them after World War II teach us that humanity can survive even in war's midst, that democratic values demonstrated through action can transform hearts and minds, and that small acts of human kindness can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or measure, but which ultimately shape the world we live in. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a forgotten chapter of history. If you found this exploration of German POWs in America meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more remarkable stories from history waiting to be told. Stories that can help us understand not just the past, but also ourselves and the world we're building for the future. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that even in the darkest chapters of history, human connection and transformation remain possible.